Give me money, give me money, give me money, give me money, give me money.
In the first age, in the first battle, when the shadows first lengthened, one stood. He chose the path of perpetual torment. In his ravenous hatred, he found no peace, and with boiling blood, he scoured the umbral plains, seeking vengeance against the Dark Lords who had wronged him. And those that tasted the bite of his sword named him the Doom Slayer.
Sadly, the only thing that's cool about Goblin Slayer isn't even coming out of its source material. Goblin Slayer's world building isn't just nonsensical, it's a fucking mess disregarding all sense of surrealism in favor of the creator creating a series to write whatever the fuck he justifies for plot's sake. I've been over this territory over and over and over again in videos after videos, but let me methodically explain why in my eyes this series is utter garbage and nothing but a walking pile of vomit that's just lazily slapped together. Knowing my background, work, and experience in as an upcoming bachelor's degree in video game development with some experience working as an editor, lead editor may that be, on several video game projects being more than 5. But to cut to the chase, Goblin Slayer takes heavy inspiration from Dungeons & Dragons. The problem with this series is that it's written so ineptly, wrapping my brain around the mechanics and mechanisms of this dead-brain autistic fantasy world is taxing my mind, considering the very fact that it makes no goddamn sense in any logical proportion whatsoever. Warhammer Fantasy to Warhammer 40k makes sense, in the very scenario that, in that universe, it's very dark and depressing, leaving all the characters that are a part of the main narrative in that world liable for the drastic measures they take to preserve the human race at all costs. This extending to human supremacy zealotism, organizations solely dedicated to ethically purging and culling the impure within the Warhammer universe. In short, when it comes to monsters and demons within the Warhammer universe, the human race doesn't fuck around. You mess up once and your life is over. But the most interesting thing about the Warhammer, despite the dystopic nature of the human race, is that the human race was able to come together to unite against the internal enemy, being demons, goblins, orcs, and everything that's not human. Goblin Slayer, being what it is, when it comes to understanding politics to ethics from the author's understanding to my interpretation of what the author understands, is quite literally an inch deep and miles of wide long. On my first read, not only did I discover many inaccuracies within the plot, but in addition to its 2 additional spin-off series, the story continues to fail building a world logically that makes any amount of sense whatsoever. Within the world of Goblin Slayer, people die. People die a fucking lot, but the reason why everyone dies within the universe is not because they were poorly equipped to deal with a situation, it's because the story retcons its first chapter and deliberately lies to the reader and the inhabitants of the world that they reside in. In the first chapter, the story tells us goblins have the intelligence of baby infants, but contradictory to this information, as the series progresses chapter after chapter, the goblin intelligence increases tenfold as they rape and pillage, defeating most of the capable adventurers within the story, increasing their numbers without much resistance or problem whatsoever. If you read the first 4 arcs of Goblin Slayer, the manga, initially, after every story arc, a character gets raped. A capable-looking adventurer decked out in armor gets overcome by a multitude of goblins, and they are raped despite their actual pedigree as adventurers, which brings into question how capable were the adventurers in the first place. This also brings into question, are goblins the real threat of the world than the actual demons and monsters that reside within the world that are supposedly there that the writer decides to not show us due to reasons that cannot be explained. Now, occasionally we would see other monsters within the series, however, the Goblin Slayer character would not fight those characters due to his inaptitude and only being capable at actually fighting the low-level goblins and to some high-level orcs when the plot necessarily requires him to fight those types of creatures. Now, here's where the story begins to not make any fucking sense at all, from any point of view. It doesn't make any sense from a design point of view, and it sure as hell doesn't make any sense from a video game design's perspective, let that be tabletop or an actual video game. To make it clear, Sword Art Online and its multiple iterations make more logical sense from a gameplay and mechanic point of view than the brain dead world I'm about to describe to you. It's not cute, it's not funny, it's abysmal and full of plot holes. To get to the point, it's just ridiculously silly to actually believe a society would actually function like this. And it's even more stupider that it actually works within the confines of this story. Let me break it down very slowly. In Goblin Slayer's world, women are literally treated like cattle to be pumped full of semen so they can be used as currency. In this universe, the green screens rape the women to reproduce due to the very fact that goblins can't reproduce themselves due to the nature of their physiology. In addition to this, because of reasons that aren't scientifically explained, goblin children and the birth rate of these green skinned monsters reproduce quicker than human children. It would take about 6 months for a human to develop within the womb of a human woman, while it takes about a week for a goblin to reproduce in the womb of a human woman, meaning that goblins are popping out fast like crazy. Now, I don't know if this information is accurate because the story doesn't give us this information and decides to joke about it instead, while simultaneously doing everything within its power to not give us any answers that we ultimately deserve for this story, like, I don't know how gods and magic work within this world and not give us the bullshit explanation of that we snap our fingers and it works, and I don't know how all of these gods can live in one kingdom and how there's no conflict between any of the cults or the religions and the factions that exist within this one singular kingdom, but that's not very important because the story does decide to not elaborate on those facts. Hey, I'm just gonna throw this fun fact out there that if you read the Goblin Slayer wiki, it's more informative than the actual manga story. Did you know there was actually a supreme god ruling over the world called Illusion that rolls dice and decides people's fate? Crazy, right? I mean, they don't even provide this information in the goddamn manga, so why should I even be reading the story when I can just read the Wikipedia page when it has more accurate information? Now, listen, I know this page is directly in the manga, however, I would like to point out the very fact that is written so poorly you wouldn't be able to know this information. Now, admittedly, in chapter 15 of Goblin Slayer, this information is provided to the reader. However, I would like to stand out and point, if I never read the Wikipedia page that gave me this information, I would have zero context to what the fuck is actually happening within the story, due to the very fact that the exposition that's directly hand-fisted to us by the author is written so abysmally you could barely understand what's happening. What's happening on screen and what's correlating with the words does not match, therefore you cannot come to this conclusion that there was actually a supreme god in this universe that was really dictating the actions of everything that was happening in the story. And also, considering the very fact that this exposition is started with once upon a time, I honestly think that wouldn't apply to what's currently happening in the story, considering you're using the prefix once upon a time, meaning a story long time ago, not a story that's currently happening within this universe. So get that bullshit out of here and tell us what the fuck is actually happening instead of putting it in a fucking cryptic riddle. In addition to dictating everyone's life in this story, he also has the ability of creating quests and manipulating dungeons and spawning dungeons within the universe. So basically, he is the supreme god of this universe. Remember in a prior video how I discussed and talked about how there was possibly a god of gods of supreme one above all being within the Goblin Slayer universe? Illusion is that being, and I had to read the fucking Wikipedia page to discover that. Anyway, with the importance of sustaining human life, especially female human life in this world filled with demons and monsters while humanity is being bombarded with creatures of the unknown, you'd expect that the inhabitants of this world would take care of itself, but you're wrong, they don't. What's explained in the series is that the human race prioritizes fighting demons and other monsters instead of fighting the home threat of the goblin invasion, and that's just the military. The Adventurers Guild's members don't give a shit about goblins either because they are weak and they don't offer up much money per quill, per request, per job. But that makes zero sense from a economic standpoint, a agricultural standpoint, or a humanitarian standpoint. As you progress throughout the story of Goblin Slayer, and its 3 spin-offs that aren't very necessary, because the military is too busy wasting its time and not protecting their home, but traveling away to faraway places to fight demons and other monsters that aren't very necessary, goblins are able to ravage throughout the ecosystem, affecting mining, farming, while simultaneously growing their unchecked population, raping women along the way. Now, you'd think the villagers would be equipped to handle this situation, situation, but you're wrong. Now, you think the capital's kingdom and governmental leaders would be equipped to handle this situation for their economic, agricultural, and ecosemic benefits, but you're wrong. Now, you'd also think the Adventurers Guild would do something about this situation, considering they live in this kingdom and operate out of it, and benefit from it economically when the kingdom does. But, once again, you're wrong. As it turns out, like priorly stated, the government and the military can't protect its own interests because they're too busy fighting demons and monsters that aren't goblins. Meanwhile, while that bullshit is happening, the Adventurer Guild does dispatch individuals to fight the goblin menace, but unfortunately, because the author hates women, the adventurers who are supposed to protect the village are rapists themselves and abduct the women, selling them most likely into sex slavery without any punishment or repercussions from any system or any government or any guild whatsoever. Now here's my question for everyone that's made it this far in this video. Do you understand why this series makes zero fucking sense yet? Not only does the kingdom not care about its own interests and its source of resources, including ecosystem, agriculture, and population, but the Adventurers Guild and its many characters besides Goblin Slayer doesn't do anything to benefit the populace as a whole. They expect the government to outsource the culling and protection of the villages, making it mandatory by the government by law, calling for the genocide of goblins to occur, considering it affects the human's life as a whole, affecting ecosystem, agriculture, mining, and every system that is pivotal for human existence to strive and survive, but the story is so goddamn stupid, it doesn't want to fix its massive plot holes. Now, in Volume 4 of Goblin Slayer, the author decides to be cute and acknowledge this plot hole exists by creating a secret society of goblins that live underneath the kingdom's capital, being controlled by evil just to be evil dark elf who worships a chaos god hell-bent on destroying all life on Earth. But the funny thing about this entire situation and this entire story arc is that it's not cute and it's not funny. It makes the story even look more stupider than it already appears to be. In addition to that, it makes the writer appear more incompetent in writing this story. Remember earlier in this video when I mentioned the very fact that the author's understanding of politics, ethics, and a variety of other topics was an inch deep and miles of wide long? This is exactly what I'm talking about. You'd think and imagine common sense would dictate the facts that this would inevitably happen within the story, but the writer deliberately made it so it could happen in the story, so it can merit it into a plot line. It's not funny, because the characters are aware of the problem with their society, but actively do nothing to change the rules of that world, even though it's within their capabilities. Even though the society that they live in is almost annihilated, if it wasn't for the main character and his merry band of adventurers who are unkillable, and of course have plot armor to protect them, everyone would have died by the dark elf and the goblin army. But here's the bigger question that I personally have in regards to the competency level and the characters that are currently within the story that isn't the main cast, because we already know they already have max level competency. So here's my question. How fucking inept is the military in combination with the Adventurer Guild for them not to notice that a bunch of goblins suck into a sewer line and began living underground underneath the capital without anyone notice for months on end? How did no one take notice of this? How inept is this military? How well defended is their actual borders in this series? It's so unbelievably and poorly written, it's insane. Now we also have to take this into account too. Remember the very fact that I mentioned the very fact that there was a god of God within this world that created quests and created dungeons for the adventures within this realm? The only reason why Goblin Slayer has this quest is because he got multiple handouts from a girl that likes Goblin Slayer, that got it from another girl that likes Goblin Slayer, that gave him the piece of paper that allowed him to go meet the Blade Maiden, which in turn allowed him to go into this quest without actually talking to any military officials that could handle the situation, or anyone that's more capable to handle this situation than Goblin Slayer. You'd think this would be a militaristic situation, but you're wrong. It's a Goblin Slayer problem because the military doesn't matter. And of course, the military is too busy to protect its own borders, which makes no sense at all, so they have to send in some mercenaries to do it. I wouldn't be surprised somewhere near the end of this entire series we revealed that the king was like a little kid or some sort of demon that was just sitting there laughing his ass off the entire time while everyone was scrambling to solve all their problems. But speaking of problems and speaking of plot holes in consideration, considering the very fact that Goblin Slayer is the only notable character in the series that actively fights against goblins to protect villages. His efforts don't matter, considering the very fact nobody cares about goblins besides him. I understand this is the emphasis of the book. It's not him going on this big grandiose crusade to save the world. It's him doing this for self-glorification, and we can talk about why he sucks as a fucking character in the next video when I talk about his character. But let me explain a little bit more, using Shadow of Mordor as an example, why this world continuously doesn't make sense. Now, no matter how stupid this may sound, and despite the very fact that I might laugh just saying this, in Volume 3 of Goblin Slayer, everyone, and when I say everyone, I mean everyone in the Adventurer Guild decides to help Goblin Slayer defeat a horde of zombies, I mean goblins, from the infamous Goblin King. Because particularly in this story arc, the Goblin King was going to take over the farm and ravish the agricultural ecosystem due to his own political agenda for wanting power. Now, here's the kicker to the entire situation. They didn't defend the farm because of economic reasons, and they didn't protect the farm because it would be an agricultural nightmare disaster, but instead they all decided they wanted to protect the farm due to the nonsensical and bullshit emotional reason that Goblin Slayer begged everyone for help and didn't want Milk Tits to lose her home. So after one talk no jutsu later and a powerful speech, everyone's willing to help because Goblin Slayer gave this other guy a beer, the guild chick says 1 gold coin per goblin kill, and some other bullshit like that. I honestly I can't even wrap my head around it. There's literally a segment in this story where this chick, basically in the farm, she basically goes on this big ass rant where she basically says, I'd rather get raped and killed here than leave this place because I don't want to lose another hope. It's the dumbest thing I've ever read. It's dreadful. I'm sorry. I'll get back to it. Okay, I'm getting back on, okay? So, notice how, like, in video games like Shadow of Mordor, everyone's fighting the orcs because they are a eccentric threat to humanity. But continuing with the Shadow of Mordor scenario, let's assume that the orcs were replaced with goblins, and Goblin Slayer was Talion without the Wraith powers. In this scenario, everything including the logic said previously in the Goblin Slayer universe and in this video exists. However, it's thrown into a Shadow Mordor perspective. If Goblin Slayer was traveling around defeating each goblin lord very much like in Shadow of Mordor, his solo efforts would logically prove fruitless due to the very fact that his party is only 5 strong, while the other goblins are moving around the map unchecked, engaging in scorched warfare, destroying everything while continuously raising their ranks and providing only for themselves, while simultaneously enlarging their ranks with unchecked population due to the very fact that the kingdom does not care, nor does the eventual care about goblins and their unchecked population growth. That meaning, if Goblin Slayer could take out a goblin lord once per week, the others would simply gain stronger and stronger, with them amalgamating forces and them randomly wandering around destroying the agricultural system of the entire human race, raiding their mines, destroying their farms, and destroying any resource that the human race initially has. In addition to this, because the military can't protect its own borders because it's too busy fighting enemies that aren't within its borders, initially the goblins would just simply get larger and larger. This in culmination with the very fact that the adventurers are refuting and not going on these mandatory quests when they have to cull the goblin species so it doesn't get too big and it doesn't have a population boom. Initially the goblin horde will become hundreds upon thousands of individuals. This in combination with the very fact that the human species women are being raped in a very large multitude, the human race female population would steadily decline more and more, meaning that there would be less human populace to actually fight the goblins. Sadly, in addition to that, because the ecosystem in agriculture, including farming and mining, was completely annihilated by the goblins, no one would have the proper equipment to actually fight the goblins, in also conjunction with no one fighting with full stomachs because no one decided to protect the villages or the farms from the goblins. And due to the very fact that Goblin Slayer is one man and his comrades are only 4 additional people, the amount of goblins that they would have to fight and kill simultaneously while maintaining and protecting the society would ultimately be too much, and eventually Goblin Slayer and his party will be wiped out and be completely annihilated by the end of the story, due to the very fact that this society makes no goddamn sense, due to the poor political system the author has set up for this world. This is the reason why Goblin Slayer politically makes zero sense, and the world building is atrocious. You can argue it's an anime, you can argue it's a manga, hell, you can even argue it's a light novel, you can argue that the scenario is unrealistic in this world. Honestly, it is, and don't argue about it, because it's just an anime, and it's just a manga, and it's just a light novel. This end of days or in-game scenario is literally happening in the story concurrently because it's written so poorly, and this is the only scenario that falls in my mind when I read this story, considering how in-depth the author is. 5 people cannot fight hundreds upon hundreds of goblins, even with the assistance of higher ranked adventurers, because at some point the numbers would go so large due to the neglect of the society and the kingdom that they live in conjunction with the Adventurers Guild, that the fight would be fruitless due to the very fact that they would gain so much numbers that they would just get one-sidedly annihilated due to the very fact that there's hundreds of thousands of goblins there. Point being, Goblin Slayer, world building, and politics are beyond stupid, and in part 2 of this video series we'll be talking about why the characters are dumb too, and why the story itself is fundamentally flawed. But that's a video for another time, just like I said, but Goblin Slayer sucks either way.